can give a few seconds to see if somebody comes on, and then.
Oh, I put live.
Oh, you know, it's fine. Yeah, I'm just trying to see if because right now nobody's online. Well, there are two people, right? So just live at the moment, right? So okay. So I just wanted to let me. I'm going to put a message in the comment section so people know. So as they come on, they'll be redirected to your YouTube, so if they want to get the full experience. Okay, so yeah, so that's the right link there. And let me pause here. Is this link for the
You got like eyeballs now.
Zay Tech YouTube page for a better experience. All right, so I'm going to make sure that they have certain things closed. All right, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على سيدنا محمد خير الأولين والآخرين وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين اللهم افتح علينا فتوح العارفين ووفقنا توفيق الصالحين وانفعنا بالقرآن بالذكر الحكيم اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما وعملا متقبلا برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين اللهم لا سهل إلا ما جعلته سهلا وأنت تجعل الحزن إذا شئت سهلا اللهم أعذنا من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا اللهم أصلح لنا شأننا كله لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته and welcome to this important series of classes related to Islamic commerce and finance entitled Rahma and Ribh, Mercy and Profit, Principles of Islamic Commerce and Finance. And so before we continue, I just wanted to offer an opportunity for those of you who may be watching from the Lamppost YouTube link, or perhaps on Twitter or wherever else, or the website if you're watching from any of those links. You can actually go to the Zaytech Academy YouTube page. I've provided the link in the comments section for you to go there. You get a better experience to be able to see myself. Right now, you're only able to see just my PowerPoint. So please go there. And for those who are registered, this problem will be resolved hopefully tomorrow. Right. So, and then let us proceed. So inshallah, we have a lot of important things to cover. I think that those of you who've chosen to participate in this particular course, that you actually will find great benefit from it. There's a tendency of students who I've taught this before. I've been teaching this course for a bit more than 10 years. And of course, naturally, I improved this as also in the process over the years. That students have the tendency to underestimate the benefit that could come from teaching what we call historically al-buyur, Islamiyya, or Islamic sales, or many different names that it is referred to as. And so this is a bit of a crash course, So typically, it's a 15 weeks, 3 hours course each week, So this is like course 1.5 hours. And the way that we plan to actually navigate the particular each lesson is that I begin with a lecture, about an hour, and then for the last half hour we have Q&A. Unless there's something that's really pressing that you need to ask about for clarification purpose, then you can move on to. I'll take a question at that particular moment, inshallah. Right. So today's introductory lecture is going to be probably the longest of the lectures I'll give. because there's a lot of philosophical work I wanted to do as a foundation of this particular course. So this first lesson is entitled Rights, Morals, and the Conundrum, or the Currency Conundrum, and so, which means that we're going to focus on some matters, as I mentioned, that which are a bit philosophical in nature, right? So I'm going to just change the slide here, and I have to change it on both of these, right? So, okay, sorry, no problem. All right, so yeah, all right, there we go. Okay, so the course description is Rahma and Ribh is being a crash course whose aim is to acquaint students with the Islamic foundations of ethical commerce and Sharia-compliant finance. Students will learn about currency in its classical and contemporary forms, ownership transfer methods, contracts, markets, and manners of trade, the integrals of valid contract, fraud, riba, avoidable risks, what is called gharar, and other exploitative transactions referred to in the books of fiqh as batil, and also in the Quran, in addition to mortgages, stocks, bonds, financing warranties, bankruptcy, monopolies, partnerships, and unacceptable competitive practices. And all discussions will be guided by the teachings of the Quran, the Sunnah, and the findings of Muslim scholars. Now, for registered students, you should have received a PDF for the weekly courses and also the lesson plan, which is along with that. And so there are some readings which you can find in the lesson plan. Each week I'll say, we'll read this page to this page from this particular book. And so that should be provided. If you haven't received it, if you're registered, inshallah, we can talk about that later, inshallah. So this is fundamentally, again, as I say, of course, description, not destruction, right? We don't want to be a course destruction, we're a course description. Right, so today's lesson, we want to cover these issues. So what we're going to talk about are what we call the 10 starting points of the study of commercial law. In the Arabic language, this translates as al-mabadi al-ashara, right? The 10 elementary aspects of any given sciences, and quite often, ulama, when they start the study of something, they highlight 10 particular points because you don't want to only study, you want to understand why you're studying it. What's the benefit of studying these things, right? How is it connected to other disciplines, among other things? We also want to talk about wealth. What does it mean to be wealthy? What is wealth? how does one acquire wealth? In other words, how do you become an owner of wealth according to the basic teachings of Islam? And then whether or not having wealth is good, right? To actually be wealthy and have good, and what's meant by good. That's another particular term we want to talk about. And then the connection between property and morality, the nature of the Sharia, and the future of money and its potential challenges in the Sharia. So we're going to talk about that eventually. So the 10 starting points of the study of Islamic commercial law, we call al-mabadi al-ashara, are the definition, the subject, the benefit, the virtue, the relationship to other sciences, the founder of this particular discipline, the name of the discipline, the sources, or rather the sources, the foundational scriptural and rational sort of sources, which are the basis of these understandings, the ruling of knowing this type of knowledge, and then a number of the topics that are covered in what we call commercial law. Now, when I studied Sharia in Morocco in the 1990s, and one of my courses was called Fiqh al-Mu'amalat. And Mu'amalat is a term often utilized to refer to matters of commerce. Mu'amalat also is used by many scholars to include anything that is involved in governing the relationship between people, right? So it's not only about sort of trade, marriage, divorce, inheritance, things like that. Jihad is, can be considered an aspect of mu'amalat as well in one sense, right? But fiqh al-mu'amalat is one of my courses. Another course that I took was called al-Qanun al-Tijari, right? Which literally translates as commercial law, which is a study of the Moroccan law code with respect to trade, study Qanun al-Shughul, right? Sort of occupational law, among other things, right? Fiqh al-watha'iq, contract law. So these are among the courses that were part of the curriculum, al-Qarawiyyin and the Kuliya Sharia, right? So we're gonna talk about again these 10 points of departure. So let's start first and foremost with the definition, what we call in Arabic al-hadd. Sometimes people use the terms like ta'rif, right? But here we have hadd. So Islamic commercial, or we can say business law, can be defined as the rules regulating the financial and related transactions between people with regard to their validity or invalidity. Financial covers the exchange of goods for currency, as well as barter exchanges. And related transactions covers the rules governing ownership transfers for no consideration, like gifts and charity. Right, so we all know what barter is. It means to barter, right? Anyone not know what a barter is? Like in Arabic, we call it mu'awada or maqayada. Anyone not know what that is? To barter? You could be honest, right? But in other words, the idea describe the type of trade happens between people where no cash is involved. Like, for instance, I'm going to trade this remote control for, I don't know, a bottle of water, right? So that's barter, right? So, like in the old days, as we say, in the old days, I'm going to trade my cow for, I don't know, 2 or 3 sheep, right? So barter, right, is the foundation, right, of trade, right? Money itself, we're going to talk a little bit later about that, like why money itself became sort of universal and important, sort of a point of mediation between the two items, the two assets that are being exchanged, and those type of situations, right? So this is what we call, again, the definition. The second issue we're going to talk about is what we call the mawdu', or the subject. So the subject of study in commercial law is human conduct, right? And which is really, in one sense, is the study of all forms of law. Excuse me, it's human conduct in the realm of trade specifically, right? So fiqh itself is concerned with human conduct and the accompanying moral values assigned to each act. Right, so law is about assigning a moral value to every human action, right? So something's either haram or it is halal, right? It can be recommended, it can be makruh, disliked, it can be wajib, it can be compulsory as well, right? So what are the things that are specific, right? So here we're concerned with human conduct in the realm of trade, right? So when we study salah, for instance, we're talking about, of course, human conduct with respect to worship or ritual, right? Here we are studying the human conduct in the realm of trade, right? What's lawful, what's unlawful, right? What makes a contract or a deal valid or invalid, right? And what is the consequence of something being declared valid or invalid? So the subject, so the hadd, right? The definition, then the second, the subject, and thirdly, we talk about the benefit, the athamara, sometimes called al-fa'ida. So what's the benefit of knowing this subject? First and foremost, it helps one to determine the legitimacy of commercial decisions, right? So I just bought something or I just sold something, how does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala classify that particular purchase, right? And then secondly, if you study it, the benefit is that it grants you a certain type of prestige, just like anything. Like, so something other people don't know, then it's like you say, hey, well, that in itself has its own benefit. And in the same way that when someone goes to university, you get a degree, he has a PhD, the person's master, or you get ijaza, right? And people are like, it gives you a type of social prestige. And people are like, so-and-so actually is educated, right? So that in itself is important, right, in the greater scheme of things, especially when we're talking about interaction with different people in society. It gives a certain type of authority. The next thing we want to talk about is what we call the fadl, or the virtue of knowing. So in other words, we have multiple hadith which exist in this particular regard. And I will say that these are three hadiths which are mentioned. One of them, it says that the Prophet ﷺ said, طَلَبُ الْحَلَالِ فَرِيضَةٌ بَعْدَ الْفَرَائِضِ, that pursuing what is lawful is a duty after all duties. This hadith itself is, the authenticity is debated, right? But it's something that's been passed down, that is just like there's a famous hadith, طَلَبُ الْعِلْمِ فَرِيضَةٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ, that the seeking knowledge is compulsory upon every Muslim. That this is has a similar sort of sound to it. And actually there's another narration of the hadith actually does say that طَلَبُ الْحَلَالِ فَرِيضَةٌ عَلَى كُلِّ مُسْلِمٍ, that the seeking halal is compulsory upon every Muslim, right? But again, we have to be careful when we quote a weak hadith and make it clear all the time that when a hadith is weak, it means that it's likely the Prophet did not say it, right? It's more likely he did not say it than he did say it. It's a possibility he did, right? But it's more likely he did not say it. But the reason or the benefit of actually being aware of these type of hadiths, I guess we can say, is that it sort of shows you that that these are the type of teachings which influence Muslim civilization, right? Just because the hadith is weak doesn't mean that Muslims did not sort of act upon it, right? The existence of those hadiths, a weak hadith is not a fabricated hadith. In other words, we can't say there's an outright lie on the Prophet ﷺ. It's just that we don't have as much confidence as we should have in it to say that the Prophet ﷺ said it. Another hadith is, Allahumma barik li ummati fi bukuriha. Oh Allah, bless my nation in its early morning efforts. So here, a hadith encouraging us to go out early in the morning to go seek our lawful provision. And there's a very famous hadith where the Prophet said, لو توكلتم على الله حق توكله لرزقكم كما يرزق الطير, that if you were to rely upon Allah to the extent that He rightfully deserves to be relied upon, then He would provide for you in the same way that He provides for the birds. تغدو خماصا وتروح بطانا. They go out with their bellies empty and they return with their bellies full. Right. So that is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ expressing the importance of tawakkul ala Allah. But here in Islam, begging itself is highly discouraged. And some scholars even say haram for you to be a beggar, right? And the Prophet said that it is better for a person to go out and to gather up firewood and to bring it to market to sell than for you to stand on the road with your hand out, and some may give and some may deny you, right? Yeah. So there's an encouragement for work, that you should be a person who is involved with work or is offering something in exchange for whatever you receive from other people. And this is why the welfare mentality itself is not Islamic, right? This idea that, listen, that I can just live off the system, right? That if I need something, that's one thing. If you're a needy person, the system can provide for you something. But there are many people in many different countries around the world, especially in Western countries, who have the idea that I'm going to do everything possible to ensure that I'm continuing to receive government benefits every single year for the rest of my life, and my children are going to be the same. So the sort of intergenerational sort of dependency upon the tax revenues from other people. Then there's this other hadith which says, مَا عُبِدَ اللَّهُ تَعَالَى بِشَيْءٍ أَفْضَلَ مِنْ فِقْهٍ فِي الدِّينِ. So no person worships Allah. I left that out. So no person worships Allah with anything more superior than understanding in religion. One learned person is harder on Satan than 1,000 unlearned worshippers. And then it's reported that Umar ibn Khattab, radiallahu anhu, he said, لا يبيع في سوقنا هذا إلا من يفقه. Said none are to transact in this marketplace of ours other than one who knows the law. Otherwise, he will devour riba willfully or unwillfully. وَإِلَّا أَخْذَ الرِّبَا شَاءَ أَمْ أَبَى. And riba itself is a term that's going to come up quite a bit during this class. But it has multiple connotations, right? Sometimes riba just is used as a super category term to refer to any type of unlawful transaction. But then we have riba, which is used specifically with respect to the disproportionate exchange of what we call fungibles, right? And we're going to talk about what is meant by fungibles and unfungibles and et cetera, things like that, right? So here's an emphasis that if you're going to go become a business person, if you're going to go to sell, or even if you're going to go to buy, that you have to have knowledge that what you're buying is lawful to buy. You have to have knowledge that what you're selling is lawful to sell, right? So, because otherwise you're going to be involved in something which is unlawful. And so that became his rule, that you can't occupy this space unless, so it becomes an example of what we call sort of virtues that of knowing this particular knowledge. The nisbah, or they say the relationship to other sciences, or rather the other sciences that this particular discipline of we call commercial law or Islamic commercial law or sales is connected with includes ilm al-tafsir, right? Of course, tafsir itself is a term for the exegesis or the interpretation of the Quran in the sense that there are verses in the Quran which speak about, right, bay', right, or sales, and the details regarding those things. We find them in the tafsir books, and then also ilm hadith, and the science of hadith, and ilm usul al-fiqh, science of usul al-fiqh, the foundations of Islamic law, right? So it's connected to all of these things. Nextly, we'll talk about who was the founder of Buyur, of course. Who is the one who actually created commercial law, right? You know, so this is spoken about, again, in any discipline, they'll talk about the founder. You know, who is it? Like, for instance, if you talk about usul al-fiqh, Islamic legal foundations or the foundations of Islamic jurisprudence, they often say, okay, Imam al-Shafi'i. So who founded it? Who started it? Say Imam al-Shafi'i. Right? Now, Imam al-Shafi'i didn't make up the science. It's just that he was the first person to actually write something authoritatively, right, about the science, a book itself, his risala, right? But of course, naturally, since commerce, trade itself is a natural sort of byproduct of human interaction, right? No one can really say or pinpoint like exactly who created, who made it up. Well, it's happened, right? You know, but in terms of like the rules and whether the halal and haramness of things, right? You know, that of course we get some of that knowledge from the Quran and from the Sunnah, you know, but largely what we as Muslims know today as Sharia compliant, you know, sort of transactions, it originates from the early Sunni jurists, right? And so I specifically refer to the early Sunni jurists because the Shia, the early Shia, in particular the Imami Shia, that they themselves were not involved or believed that Ijtihad was haram, right? Especially if you think about the 12 were Shia. So when the 12 Imams were alive, they said, well, Ijtihad is invalid, Qiyas is invalid, right? So it took them some time before they started to embrace the concept of Ijtihad. So, but the Sunni scholars had got started on this very early, right? So, but once the 12th Imam, or supposedly, was born and it was kept in his lesser occultation, and then later on disappeared into his greater occultation, which supposedly returned towards the end of the time. Then after that, you know, the mantle of Shi'ism was passed on what we call the Sufara, their ambassadors, these three men, you know, who were supposedly communicating to the last of the Imams in secret. And then eventually, the Mushahidun, the period of Shihad came after that, right? But so the Sunni scholars got, you know, started on this very early. And then a 19th century Maliki jurist known as Ibn al-Hajj al-Fasi from Morocco, from Fes, 13th century, I'm sorry, here, well, yeah, the 13th century Islamic, you know, but from the 19th century, he says that the beginnings of fiqh itself overall, not only fiqh of Islamic commerce, goes back to 27 of the Prophet's companions. And the most important of those 27 are seven, and they are Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Umar ibn Khattab, Ali ibn Abi Talib, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Abdullah ibn Umar, Zayd ibn Thabit, and Aisha radiallahu anha, right? And then, of course, you know, their knowledge and inherited by the successor generations. So what we're learning, much of it can be traced back to a very early period in Islamic history, a lot of these rules, right? You know, so I remember some years ago, there was a a brother I knew who had started a business, and he was involved with some haram type of things. And when I was confronted him about it, he said to me, said, this has nothing to do with, it's nothing to do with Islam. This is just business, right? So he thought that Islam had nothing to say about business. Now, later on, we're going to talk about the nature of the Sharia, right? And we'll learn then that there are aspects of Sharia which are descriptive and others that are prescriptive, right? And in the area of Islamic, we call the mu'amalat here, we call the buyur, that they are largely descriptive as opposed to prescriptive, right? In ibadat, you find a lot of description, right? So it's not only that you have to pray, that Allah tells you how to pray. You not only have to fast, but He tells you how to fast, right? But in mu'amalat or in sales, the default is that that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only assigning a moral value to the human activity itself, halal, haram, right? Recommended or disliked. So we'll come back to that. So then the name, the ism, what do we call it? What we're translating here as Islamic commerce or Islamic business, terms like a mu'amalat or fiqh al-buyur or just buyur. You can find al-buyur a chapter in pretty much any book of fiqh, any book of hadith. You have this chapter of sales. These goes way back, right? Then we talk about, again, what is the foundation, the evidentiary foundation of these teachings. So all judgments of commercial law are an extension of one or more of 17 Islamic sources. Among Sunnis, there are 4 undisputed sources, Quran, Sunnah, Ijma', Qiyas, and then 12 which are disputed. Maliki jurists largely embrace all 16. Right? I'm a Maliki, right? So all 16 sources, and differ over the inclusion of a 17th known as mura'at khilaf or dispute consideration. Now, that's important because the rulings that you may hear in public, right, with respect to Islamic Sharia compliance, right, the answers to whether or not a type of transaction is compliant may depend upon what particular madhab the person has adopted, or what list of sources have they validated as legitimate to deduce that particular judgment that they have stated about the thing. And I think that this is something that gets missed quite often, right? In a lot of the conversations, especially with respect to Islamic finance, because quite often we think that there's just simply one way or one answer to every single example. Even when we talk about riba, we're going to talk about some of the sort of discontinuities between classical riba and what we classify as riba today, right? And that's why talking about currency is really important. That's why we'll see as we work up to it. That's why I want to deal with that today. Next is the ruling, the hukm. So what's the ruling of knowing buyur? We already heard the statement of Umar ibn Khattab, لا يبيع في سوقنا هذا إلا من يفقه. No one shall sell in this marketplace of ours, and no one shall transact in this marketplace of ours except for one who knows the law, right? So it can be fard aini, fard kifai. Right? So the difference between fard aini and kifai is that fard aini is an individual obligation. In other words, that every single person needs to know, right? But for mu'amalat, not every single person needs to know the rules of trade, right? But fard kifai, in other words, if we say fard kifai, it means that someone in the community needs to know what the rules are. But since trade itself is so universal, everyone is involved in trade. Because remember, barter itself is trade. Right? When I used to work as a chaplain in the prison. I remember one time the brothers came to my office because they're not allowed to have cash in the prison. They say, well, and one brother say, well, I gave him a bag of potato chips last week, and he says that, if I give him the chips, he'll give me two packs of Oreos next week. They asked me, is that riba? And I was really shocked. I never thought I would find myself in that type of situation to answer that kind of question. But it was a really interesting barter. arrangement within the prison. They actually are not supposed to do it, like according to the rules of the prison, but they do it all the time, right? You know, so they say, well, who cares what the prison has to say about the rules, right? So they trade quite often, right? So, but it was really an interesting question. I say, well, you know, he's trading the bag of potato chips for 2 packs of Oreos. Is that, you know, then I have to think about, okay, what madhab and what's the reason for something being riba or not. So I think that the stronger position to say is that knowing the rules of trade is compulsory upon every single Muslim, right? So anyone who wants to involve himself with some type of trade, a sell or a purchase, they need to have knowledge of the licitness or the illicitness of that particular transaction, right, before they do it, right? And that's, of course, as long as there is a hukam known in the Sharia itself. If there's not a hukam known in Sharia, then the majority of the view that the default, anytime a novel type of transaction is created, is that it's halal, yeah, until proven haram. Right, and that's the opposite of ibadah. Ibadah, right, worship, the default is that something is haram until proven halal. Right? الأصل في مياهنا الطهارة في الأرض والثياب والحجارة والأصل في الأبضاع واللحوم والنسب والأموال للمعصوم تحريمها حتى يجيء حل ففهم هداك الله ما يمل. Right, so that's sort of from a poem of a scholar known as Abdurrahman Sa'adi, where he talks about, okay, that the default status of water and of garments and of stones on the earth, right, is that they are ritually clean, right? Right. In other words, if you are praying on the floor, for example, but then you suspect, okay, is there some najasa, right? Some filth on the floor, right? If you can't prove that there was something there, then the default is, okay, well, you're fine, nothing to worry about. Or some water, you walk outside and some water drops on your head. Right? Say, okay, was that like urine, or was it, like, you understand, was it the rain? You don't know. Did somebody spit? Right? You don't know what, right? But it's like, okay, the aslu fiha al-ibaha, or that tahara, right? You know, but then he goes on and says also, but on the obverse you have is that الأصل في الأبضاع واللحوم والنفس والأموال لمعصوم تحريمها حتى يجيء الحل. Right, with respect to, you know, sort of the opposite sex, you know, the respect to the flesh that you eat, you know, the meat that you eat, the property of other peoples, is that the default is that those things are haram until proven to be halal. You know, you can't just say, well, okay, well, at this moment, I think this woman's my wife, right? You know, you didn't get married yet. It's like, well, I think she is, right? You know, in the matter of niyat, you know. You know, it's by the intentions that all matters, right? No, that's not, it has to be something established. And the same thing for somebody offering you meat. Has it been slaughtered properly? Was Allah's name mentioned over it? Or did somebody sacrifice this to an idol, right? You know, so the hukum itself would vary according to person to person, but if there is a judgment that exists in Sharia, then we would apply that. But if there's no judgment, and since we're talking about financial transactions, that the default, according to the majority of ulama, is that things are halal until proven haram, right? So if a person says you can't buy Bitcoin, for example, right, okay, and they have to prove it to you, right, because it's a novel type of commodity, right? And then among the topics that will be covered in fiqh al-buyu', for instance, the integrals of a valid contract. How do I know a contract is valid? What needs to be there in order for us to be Sharia compliant? What are the valid types of property? What type of things can I own and what kind of things can I not own? How do I transfer property? Right? If I own your pencil, Willie's pencil, if he owns his pencil, you know, I can't just go grab it from him and say it's mine. Right? It doesn't become my property because I took it from him, right? It's still his, unless he says, okay, no, here you can have it. Now it's mine, right? So there are different ways to become an owner of something. And then we talk about the individual ownership rules, partnerships, and analogs and precedents for contemporary commercial jurisprudence, you know, among other things, right? So these are called the masail of fiqh al-buyu'. I'm sorry. That's for the people who missed that one. All right, so now let's talk a bit about becoming a property owner. Acquisition, wealth, and ownership. This is a really important hadith in the Tirmidhi, Imam Tirmidhi's Jami', where the Prophet ﷺ, he said, Al-ardu abdullah, wal ibadu ibadullahi, man ahya muwatin fahiya lahu. So all land is God's land, and all people are God's people. And whoever gives life to a dead land, it belongs to him. Now, this particular hadith is important for a lot of reasons, So because we live in a time where God is no longer at the center of center of people's interest anymore. But in the pre-modern period, not only in Muslim lands, but throughout the world, that God was at the center of everything. And when we reflect upon why we were created to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And if you add Araqib Asfahani's opinion, they say we were created to do khilafah in the earth, in other words, to be stewards of the earth, and also to imarat al-ard, in order to also to build and populate the earth as well, right? So it's ibadah, that's imara, and khilafah, right? So all three of those things, right? And so Allah created us to establish His worship, right? So when all the land belongs to God, that means that if God's people own land, then the land belongs to God's people, right? And this sort of becomes the foundation of ideas about how an Islamic territory cannot revert back to a non-Islamic territory, right? And you can find similar sort of ideas that were promoted in the past among Christians, et cetera, right? So Christians have a sort of like this idea of divine right, or if you go back to the Treaty of Torres Diaz, brokered between Spain and Portugal, who were warring against one another, and the Pope had actually brokered a treaty between them, and then pretty much divided the world into two different parts, and basically say, okay, well, this part goes to Portugal, this part goes to Spain, right? I believe it's Torres Diaz. Hopefully I'm not wrong about that, But basically, this is why, for instance, Brazil speaks Portuguese. And Mexico speaks Spanish, right? So between the Spanish and the Portuguese, and so even before they were here, they say, well, this is all God's earth, and we're the people of God, so it belongs to us, right? So, but again, it wasn't only them. So Muslims similarly had a similar type of thinking on this matter for the most part. And when ibadullah, and the servants are God's servants, in other words, and all people are God's people, meaning that no person is born a slave, right, to another person. They're born slave to God, right? So that's also. And then he goes on and says, whoever gives life to a dead land, it belongs to him, right? So with the condition, of course, that it's not owned by someone else, right? And if any of you saw the interview between Professor Jordan Peterson and Benjamin Netanyahu some years ago, I think it may have been more than one interview, but I remember the very first interview. And Netanyahu was making this argument, this legal argument that, the Palestinians who were here, they had land, but they weren't doing anything with it. They weren't cultivating it, so we had the right to take it. Right? So that becomes an additional argument that they make. But Islamic law, the Sharia, teaches that if a land belongs to someone, it's already established owner and well known, even if they're not doing something with it, you can't just go and take it from them, right? So it requires a period of time. So, for instance, the following hadith, man haza shay'an ashara sinina fahiya lahu, or fahuwa lahu, I'm sorry, that whoever acquires something for 10 years, it belongs to him. And so this is sort of like usually applied to real estate. This is a hadith, again, its authenticity is not completely confirmed, right? But Ibn Qayyim Jawziyya mentions it in one of his books as well, is Turuq al-Hukmiyya. And so you'll find a number of scholars who support the idea, okay, well, is in order for something that previously belonged to someone else to transfer to someone, the new owner would have had to have occupied that space for a period of 10 years with conditions that, for instance, that the previous owner is aware of it, does not object to it, and also that the new owner is claiming to be the owner of the new land, and the previous owner doesn't object to the claim, right? So there are a lot of details that go along with this, and the Prophet ﷺ said it in multiple ways. Man ahya ardan maytatan fihi lahu. That whoever gives life to a dead land, it belongs to him. So again, land is not owned by anyone. Land where no farming or anything's being done on, no buildings are being constructed upon it. In other words, similar to what we talked about before about, okay, going out in the early morning to seek your provision, not being a beggar, right? The Prophet ﷺ said, okay, if you own land, you should do something with it, right? The land should just not be, just be left, right? Just barren, right? That you have responsibility in the same way like you have responsibility with your hair, right? So even the Prophet said that man kana lahu sha'run falyukrimhu, that whoever has hair, then let them take good care of it, right? So anything that you have is a blessing. You have it's a responsibility that you have. So if you own land, you have responsibility to actually make it productive. You have responsibility to make it productive. وَمَنْ أَمَرَ عَرْضًا لَيْسَتْ لِأَحَدٍ فَهُوَ أَحَقُّ. Whoever populates a land that doesn't belong to anyone has more right to it. So here we see like effort. You can think about this in another way as well. So here we're largely talking about real estate, but even we call sort of the manqul, or sort of the movable type of properties. You go outside and let's say, I don't know, imagine that this place is not owned by anyone. You find yourself an apple tree, orange tree, whatever, and it's nothing's on the ground. You climb it and you grab it. It's yours, right? Well, on what basis is it yours? It's yours because you put the effort into it. You did the work. That's how it becomes yours. You do the work and then it belongs yours. Or if it's on the ground, you bend down, you pick it up. It's now yours. And somebody comes by and snatches it from you, injustice, right? So again, even the philosophical ideas about justice and injustice, they develop from just property rights, right? So here's a question that I often ask. I'm going to ask you all too. First and foremost is, what is wealth? Or rather, a better question is this. What does it mean to be wealthy? Anyone can answer. What does it mean to be wealthy? Anybody like to take a stab at that? No? To own what? Yeah. The afia. Okay, yeah. That could be sort of spiritual wealth, right? Sort of, physical wealth, right? You have good health, right? But most of the time when people think of being wealthy, you're a wealthy person because you own what? Money. People say money. Your money, you're rich, right? So in other words, they say, okay, well, Zaytech and all this land over here, let's say if they have zero balance in their bank account. Is Zaytech poor now? Because they have no money? So no. If anything, Zaytech is more wealthy than people who only have money. But see, remember that money is just a medium of exchange. Money is a medium of exchange. In other words, so again, coming back to my example about the cow and the sheep. One guy owns a cow, and he say, well, hey, I'll trade you 2 of my sheep for your cow. And he may say, well, okay, sounds like a good enough deal. Here, okay, take my cow, and I'll take your sheep. But then later on, he may say, you know what? I probably could have got like 4 sheep for that, right? And then he said, you know what? He probably knows that too. He cheated me. You understand? So it causes this type of this confusion and this distrust, right? So people came up with something else. They said, well, we need something else to actually, something else which would remove the sense that one has been defrauded, right, from the equation. So money is born, right? And of course, primitive money takes different forms. Is it conchs? Is it beads? Depending on, again, where you are. But eventually people, they embrace gold and silver, right? Gold is non-corrosive, is rare, right? So eventually it starts to have certain types of value assigned to it, right? And people accepted, okay, universally, that gold has value, that gold is a valuable substance, and it became the standard for the transfer of one asset to the other. So it stands in the middle. It's a middleman between my cow and your sheep, right? Or my apple pie and your cherry pie, right? So whatever. So barter, itself became, less efficient or much more prone to confusion, and the sense that people have been dealt injustices. So basically, but people make the mistake is they think that, okay, to be wealthy is to have money. And if you go back to the Iraq, the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, for instance, and the fall of Iraq, I recall seeing news broadcasts where the Iraqis were raiding the banks, and they were coming out of the banks with these pieces of paper, what was once known as their money. I think they call them lira or something else similar to that. People thought, I'm rich. But they weren't rich. Why? Because those pieces of paper meant nothing if you didn't have a working government. You didn't have any stability. Those pieces of paper only had value, on the basis of, what the government and other governments assigned to them. Right? But since there was no longer government, there was no value. So again, to have money is not to be wealthy. To be wealthy is to have, again, property, to have real estate, to own a cow, own a sheep, right? To have your food, to have your furniture, have your clothing, right? That's actually real wealth, because I use my money to buy those things, to have intrinsic value, intrinsic benefit, right? So that's what real wealth is. And so when we look at zakat, for instance, zakat is due on what? It's due on, yes, it's due on gold and silver, yes. But it's also due on farm produce and livestock. Real wealth, right? Real wealth. So you give a poor person a cow, think about that. It's like, as you pay your zakat, you're giving them a cow, right? Which is, often it was more so sheep most of the time. They give them sheep and goat, right? But even those things, okay, what can I do with it? Okay, I can drink the milk of the goat or the cow, right? But eventually those things may have babies as well, right? I have wealth that actually ends up growing, right? And the same thing for friends. You give me a crop. If I know something about farming, I can take seeds, I can plant them. You understand? So we have to sort of change the paradigm. The paradigm that we live with right now is one where people think that to be rich means to have cash. Yeah, cash comes in handy. Like, for instance, you want to travel somewhere. It's like, I want to take vacation. If you don't have any cash, but you have property, you have like actual assets, physical assets, you can sell them and then you can get cash and then you can go and pay somebody and go somewhere else, naturally, right? But if you have nothing, you're not really wealthy, right? And actually, if you can have a bunch of cash and you put it in the bank, and you don't realize that with inflation, the longer you have your money in the bank, that what happens is that inflation, the buying power of those dollars decreases over time, because every time they print more money, the buying power goes down. Now, for instance, I'll give you an example of this. In 1971, gold was valued at $41 per ounce in 1971. How much is gold now per ounce? It's more than $3,000, $3,300 per ounce now, right? So that's not only a reflection in the increase in the value of gold, but it also reflects a decrease in the value of dollars. People forget that part about it. So you put your money in the bank and say, oh, okay, you have $10,000 in the bank. And you guys have more than that. So 10,000, and so then next year you still have $10,000 in the bank. No, you don't. You have less than $10,000 because the buying power is actually less than what it was 1 year ago. And so for that reason, this is why, of course, a lot of financial specialists say, well, no, you should take your money and put it in things that appreciate, assets, invest in the stock market or whatever, real estate, things like that. So to be wealthy is to have wealth, not to have money. Right? So wealth is, again, got my microphone, got my computer, right? So all these things, that's what real wealth is. And then the question is, okay, well, is it, what is good? What's meant by good? So we say, okay, wealth is good. And we can talk about good in two different ways. What we call ontological good, in the sense that if something fulfills your needs or your wants, then it's good. In other words, it's not a moral sort of judgment I'm making about it, right? Like, for instance, a thief, if a thief is able to get the money from the person he robs, then that's good for the thief. In other words, because it fulfills the needs of the thief. But moral good is, of course, the type of good that not only, it doesn't harm others, right, in the process, So Islam, of course, endorses the second, not the first. But typically, when we talk about property, we call them goods, right? We call them goods. It can be physical good. It can be sort of a spiritual good. It can be a psychological good, a utility. And the Quran refers to money as good as well. There are multiple verses, like one in Baqarah where it says, كُتِبَ عَلَيْكُمْ إِذَا حَضَرَ أَحَدَكُمُ الْمَوْتُ إِنْ تَرَكَ خَيْرًا الْوَصِيَّةُ لِلْوَالِدَيْنِ وَالْأَقْرَبِينَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ حَقًّا عَلَى الْمُتَّقِينَ. It is prescribed for you when death comes to one of you, if he leaves any goods, that the legacy go to his parents and next of kin as is fair, as appropriate for the conscientious, right? So if he leaves any goods, right? So this goods, it means wealth, right? إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لِرَبِّهِ لَكَنُودٌ وَإِنَّهُ عَلَى ذَلِكَ لَشَهِيدٌ وَإِنَّهُ لِحُبِّ الْخَيْرِ لَشَدِيدٌ. A man is indeed ungrateful to his Lord, and he bears witness to that, for he is sure violent in love of goods, right? So goods mean like wealth, property. In other words, so it's a good, but it's not necessarily, because something is a good doesn't make it good, right? So we call them goods, but they're not always good, because some goods are haram. You understand? Prostitution is a good, right? But it's haram, right? See, it's and so property rights, or rather property ownership itself, in a lot of ways is the foundation of a lot of the ideas that we have about justice, injustice, oppression. Because remember the example I gave of, okay, I picked up that apple. That's my apple now. And then someone walked by and they knocked me down and take my apple from me. Right? And animals do it all the time. Right? One animal kills another, and then brethren come up, oh, it's mine now. He did all the work, but then the other animals pounce on the prey, right? And they take it away from their brethren. But human beings, and we have a different of course, animals get outraged, but in that particular realm, of course, we know how they resolve issues. And we want to ensure that we don't resolve our issues in the same way, because we're human beings, right? We're rational, right? Or at least we're more rational, supposed to be, than others. So, but again, ideas about justice, right? So it's like, so right there, I have a right. It's my apple. I have the right to this apple. Why? Because I did the work. I went out and I sought it and I picked it up. So when someone takes it from me now, that is injustice, is oppression, right? But also we get ideas about intelligence from property ownership, or rather from property management. In the old world, right, for much of our history, spendthrifts. A spendthrift was classified as what in Arabic language is called a safi, which translates as a fool. Right? Who's a fool? Right? Spendthrifts. Now, this is a quote from a British psychologist by the name of Michael Hand, and he talks about the idea of intelligence. He says, it remains an open question whether intelligence is a product of nature or nurture, or whether there is any meaningful way of quantifying the respective contributions of the two. attempts to write an answer to this question into the concept of intelligence itself are wholly misguided. Intelligence might be innate or fixed, but it is not innate or fixed by definition. And the position one happens to take in the nature-nurture debate has no bearing at all on one's ability to distinguish intelligent people from unintelligent ones. In other words, we typically judge the intelligence of people on the basis of their behavior, right? So economy is a moral virtue, right? So economics itself is a branch of moral philosophy. So we talk about people's virtues, say, well, this person is temperate, this person is fair and just, this person has courage. But the person who has economy, in other words, that you have a good balance of your income and expenditures, if you can balance them well, then you're an intelligent person. And of course, your intelligence grows to the extent that you not only have a good balance, but sometimes your income can increase and you have almost no expenditures, and that makes you much more intelligent. So in one sense, not all rich people, but many rich people can be classified as intelligent on that particular, at least in that particular way, right? But just because a person's rich, we know, it doesn't mean they're smart, right? Or they're intelligent, because sometimes people just get lucky, right? And a lot of lucky people out there, right, in the world. In the old world, the different ways that intelligence was measured included, like we said, economy. Political shrewdness was another way. Right? Even in the Arabic language, you have a word for intelligence. We know al-dhaka, fatana, but then there are also words like al-makar and like ad-daha, right? So a politically shrewd person, right? Like Muawiyah ibn Abi Sufyan and Amr ibn al-As, Mughira ibn Shu'bah, they're referred to as the duhat of the ummah, the shrewd men from the ummah, right? In other words, they're politically shrewd people, right? In other words, that's a type of intelligence, but they consider to be very negative as well, right? Because you have political shrewdness, in some ways, it kind of means like that you're good at tricking people, right? So you're very skilled at outmaneuvering your competition. Emotional restraint was another sign of intelligence. But then also faith. And Islam introduced this aspect as well. It's like faith. وَمَنْ يَرْغَبَ عَنْ مِلَّةِ إِبْرَاهِيمَ إِلَّا مَنْ سَفِهَ نَفْسَهُ. That who is it who would turn away from the way of Abraham except for one who makes a fool of himself, right? So in other words, to have safaha, right? Be a state of foolishness, or to be an individual foolhardy, or is a spendthrift, like a gambler, for instance, is not a very intelligent person. And so as mentioned before, okay, so the foundations of all of our ethical teachings, they come from the Quran, Sunnah, and from reason. And all of us are probably familiar with what we call the stated interests of Islam as well. Yarhamakallah. We call it masalih al-mu'tabara. So the protection of religious freedom, protection of bodily integrity, protection of sanity, protection of family, protection of property, protection of honor, the stated interests of Islam. And they're typically ordered in a certain fashion. Imam al-Ghazali says that the highest interest of Islam is the protection of religious freedom, and especially protection of Islam, Islamic faith. Right? So he says that the worst of crimes that one can commit is a crime against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You often hear people say, well, so-and-so died, he wasn't Muslim, but he's a good person. Well, okay, they may have been a good person to you, but were they a good person to God? You understand? So that's all that matters for Allah, is like, you're good to, and Allah doesn't demand a lot. He just wants you to acknowledge he is your creator and he has the right of your devotion, right? And that Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is his messenger. That's the source of salvation. But there are a lot of people actually who know that that's the truth, and they refuse to, again, to acknowledge it. You say, you know what, my heart tells me this right, but, you know, I don't have any reason not to say this or to acknowledge it openly. And so Allah, okay, no problem. Go to hell forever. Right? Right? So even if the person may give a lot of charity, may have, you understand, things like that. So again, this is that world where God is at the center. This is the world that Imam Ghazali lives in, right? And so that's the most important. But also the worst of the crimes are those committed against God, like idolatry, shirk, kufr, ridda, apostasy. But he said the second most serious crime that one can commit is a crime against a human person, especially a believer, right? Because Allah created the human being to worship him, and if you take a believer out of this world, as the Quran says, وَمَن يَقْتُلْ مُؤْمِنًا مُتَعَمِّدًا فَجَزَاؤُهُ جَهَنَّمُ خَالِدًا فِيهَا وَغَضِبَ اللَّهُ عَلَيْهِ وَلَعَنَهُ وَأَعَدَّ لَهُ عَذَابًا عَظِيمًا. That whoever kills a believer intentionally, then his recompense will be the hellfire. Living and residing therein forever. Allah will be angry at that person. He curses him, and he's prepared for that person an enormous punishment. So to kill a believer is the worst thing that one can do, but also to harm a person's physical body, right, as well. Right? So I said after murder, then you have physical, like decapitations, dismemberment of people's bodies, or, you know, harming them in a way that they are no longer able to use parts of their body, right? So those the second words. But then he said the third the third level of gravity when it comes to crimes are those committed against people's property, right? So then he goes back and say, okay, well, why Allah created the human being to worship him, right? So when the human being comes into this world and decides to worship other than Allah, then again, you're not here pursuing the purpose for which you are created. Allah created the human being to worship him. If you killed a person, then that's fewer people on the planet to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And they say, okay, well, if you destroy people's property or take their property from them, then you expose them to starvation and all the types of tribulation and eventually death. And again, once again, the reason for which a human being has been created is now is undermined, right, through those actions, right? So these are important philosophical issues to reflect upon when we talk about Islamic law, and in particular with regard to Islamic commercial law. And then, of course, human actions, they are given at least one of 5 moral values. Actions are either compulsory, recommended, neutral, disliked, forbidden, and then we can talk about it being valid or invalid. And when we say something compulsory, it doesn't simply mean that you have to do it. It means that if you do it, there's reward. If you don't do it, then you're subject to punishment by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Sometimes in this world, but definitely in the hereafter, right, if you don't carry it out. You have to pray. You have to pray on time, right? And you say, well, I know that, but I'm just not going to do it anyway. Okay, subject to punishment. But if you do it, there's reward. Recommended means that you get a reward if you do it. Neutral means that there's no reward, no punishment. You don't have to do it. You're not obligated, and also it's okay if you don't do it, right? Disliked or makruh means that if you don't do it, there's reward. So if you don't go to sleep after Asr, there's a reward. You get sleepy, I'm going to go to sleep after. Why? Because if I go to sleep after Asr, then I might miss Maghrib, right? If I go to sleep after Maghrib, I might miss Isha, right? So it's makruh. It's not a sin. If you're sleepy, you're just sleepy, right? But it's better for you to try to keep yourself awake and then to carry it out. Haram or forbidden means that if you do it, you're subject to punishment. If you don't do it, then there's a reward. There's a reward in it. So you get the idea. So, in other words, so the Sharia itself is concerned with every single thing that a human being does. Everything that we do has a moral value. Even me waving my hand like this or like that, everything has a hukum, right? You know, I can keep doing this over and over and over, right? And it may irk you, and that in itself is pretty much neutral if I'm just doing it. No, but if it starts to irk you, and then I know it irks you, and I keep doing it, and that itself, it can become sinful, right? So, but there's a moral value assigned to everything that we do, right? And so, if we're involved in trade, there's a particular moral value assigned to every particular transaction. Then, again, moving towards the end, I told you like this particular lecture is going to be the longest, right, of all of them. We want to talk about what is called fiat money, fiat currency. Now, fiat currency is the money that is pretty much authorized by the government. It's not backed by anything. It's only backed by a promise from the government that it's worth something. Now, in the history of most countries, gold and silver used to be the universal currency. And that was the case in the United States as well, in America. And as I mentioned before, the reason why the transition into currency or money was because of the problems that were developed from barter. Then in 1913, the Federal Reserve Bank was created, right here in the United States. And the Federal Reserve Bank is not a government bank. The Federal Reserve Bank is a private bank that, for some reason, has the exclusive right to print dollars. The Constitution gives the government the right to print money. But the Federal Reserve Bank, for some reason, has the exclusive right to print money, of course, through the U.S. Mint, right? They'll call the U.S. Mint and they print. And it's not a physical printing of money. We're going to talk about that in a second, right? But 1913, the Federal Reserve Bank was created. Sorry, I made something here. So I'm going to hit a little bit. The Federal Reserve Bank was created in 1913, and this happened. And then in 1933, under President Theodore Roosevelt, there was a buyback program, right, developed, like the gold buyback. So any Americans who actually own gold, and which was worth anything less than $100, was you could keep it, but anything above $100 or more, that you had to turn it over to the government. And so the government gave those people paper money or promissory notes in exchange for the money, the gold that they took from them, but with the understanding that it was as good as gold, right? So your money still is as good as gold, but we're going to take it from you. We're going to take it all from you. And so the American dollar was backed by gold all the way up until President Nixon's presidency. And in 1971, he decided that they announced that we're no longer going to peg U.S. dollars to gold anymore. Right? And this was supposed to be a temporary thing, that they were supposed to cancel this temporary, supposed to last for a year or something like that, but then went on forever. Right? And that itself naturally became a big problem, because you have this paper money similar to the Iraq example, right? It's only worth what the government claims it's worth, right? And then what other governments around the world believe that it's worth, right? And that devalues the money. The money's been devalued over time, Now, 2 years later, the benefit, the boon that came to the U.S. dollar was what's called the petrodollar agreement. So all of the OPEC countries, they signed on to this, I don't know if you call it a charter or some type of formal agreement, was basically said that they're going to peg, that, or in other words, that they're going to make sure that they're going to demand that anytime someone wants to buy oil or gas, right, that they have to pay in U.S. dollars. That in itself led the United States to become the most powerful empire on the planet today, the petrodollar agreement. Now, and basically what happens is it sort of operates like according to the basic rules of an audible talab, in Arabic we call it, for some reason in English, sort of supply and demand. Supply and demand. So in other words, so if as the U.S. dollar is in high demand, right, the more its value increases, the more buying power it has, right? Like anything else, right? And of course, the less demand that something has for it, then the less buying power that it has. And then eventually it also leads to the U.S. dollar becoming like we saw the world reserve currency. So banks around the world actually they had to own a certain amount of dollars. So when transfers happen, that they can pay people in dollars in different amounts, right? So, but the whole fundamental point is that fiat money itself, it used to represent gold. It hasn't represented gold since 1971, and this becomes the case all around the world as well. And an interesting story, too, that I think to tell is that if we go back to even prior to the American Revolution, in the United States, in the American colonies at the time, it wasn't called the United States yet, in the American colonies, they developed a type of paper money. They called it the colonial script. It wasn't backed by anything, no gold or silver, right? So the American colonies, they were still loyal to England, right? They're loyal to the crown, and so, but they decided, this kind of things are kind of hard here, that we're gonna create our own money. They created their own paper money, and as a result, in all the different colonies used to utilize this money to transact between one another. The crown, the king, found out about this. Benjamin Franklin actually sent word and communicated with the Bank of England and told them, why they were doing this. But in the following year, a new edict was passed that actually outlawed the use of the colonial script, right? And that itself led to a Great Depression inside of the United States. And so, it wasn't the United States yet, but the colonies, right? And actually, this is one of the major catalysts for the American revolutions that a lot of people don't know. This is one of the catalysts for that. They decided, no, you can't use that money anymore. Only our money. We sort of, so they want to keep them poor so they can keep control of them. But they came up with this sort of really fancy way to enrich themselves, even though it was enriching themselves from really pretty much nothing. But people themselves agreed with, no problem, we're fine with it, right? If the community places value on something, then, we're going to see when we go deeper into the rules of Islamic trade, that itself becomes an overriding basis for validation, right? As long as there's no text that actually that outlaws or sort of forbids a certain type of transactions. Now, currently, the world debt is $324 trillion, right? So of all the countries in the world, that's how much debt, collectively the countries they owe. To who they owe it to, right? Often we say they owe it to the banks, because the theory is that among human beings, there's also a food chain, right? And at the top of the food chain are the bankers, right? The people who actually make the imaginary money. And the United States national debt is $36 trillion and counting. Some say, I don't know if it's already past 37, but that was been the fear. And so that's why people say, well, Elon Musk he had a big problem with the current bill that was just passed, because it increases the national debt and deficit, things like that, right? But this is where we are, So, and remember what we talked about we talked about, I'm actually looking at the wrong slide for you guys. Let's go back here. Right, so that's the, remember we talked about when we said fools, right? So we're fools governed by fools, right? Remember, so a fool is another word for a spendthrift, right? So, and if we said that, one of the signs of intelligence is that you're able to balance your income and expenditures, right? So in the entire world, we're a bunch of fools, right? We could talk about even American citizens. How much debt, credit card debt, student loan debt, right? we have a debt system, right, that we live in, and that itself is a big problem. And in the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He said, وَلَا تُؤْتُوا السُّفَهَاءَ أَمْوَالَكُمُ الَّتِي جَعَلَ اللَّهُ لَكُمْ قِيَامًا وَارْزُقُوهُمْ فِيهَا وَاكْسُوهُمْ وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. Do not give the feeble-minded your property, which God has made a means of support for you. Actually, Allah means don't give the feeble-minded their property that God has made a means of support for them. So Allah actually says for you because you're responsible. So this verse was talking about orphans, right? Because when orphans are young, of course, they can't manage their own money. So this is a message to those. So the orphans are called feeble-minded people, right? Because they didn't know. You give an orphan little kid some money, a lot of money, they're going to buy a lot of things that's not going to be any worth for them, right? So we want to make sure that they make good decisions with their money. We're not supposed to just let them go, hey, it's your money, you go and buy whatever you want. No. We want to help them to make good decisions with their money, right? So, provide for them with it and clothe them, right, with it and speak to them in considerate terms. I'm almost done, inshallah. So this is an important question too, because with the rise of digital currencies, it's a legitimate question of whether or not there is what we can call an Islamic currency. And this is going to be important too when we talk about riba, among other things as well, because depending on where you stand when it comes to whether or not there is an Islamic currency, that can have an effect on whether or not you classify something as haram or not, right? So some say, okay, well, Islamic currency is gold and silver. Okay, well, on what basis? Because Allah didn't say there's a zakat on paper money, right? It's on gold and silver. Right? As a matter of fact, there's other types of currency that existed during the time of the Prophet, like fulus, right? All right, so fulus is like this sort of copper-based types of metals or raw, lower metals that when a person is said to be muflis, it means that you only own fulus. All you have is like pennies, for instance, right? That's all you own, right? Or you don't even own that at all, right? You're muflis, you're bankrupt, right? So some say that. But then there's this quote from Imam Malik, which gives the impression that what is considered money can change, right? Depending on just how people embrace it. So it said if Hajj were to become a common basis of exchange between people in a way that it happens with minted cash, we would disapprove of a sale against gold and silver with delayed payment. In other words, he's saying that the rules of riba would apply to Hajj if Hajj became the basis for, became currency, right? In the same way that gold and silver is currency. So that's one way you can read what Imam Malik is saying here. Now, cash itself. So all of us, we know what dollars look like. And hopefully we'll continue to know what dollars look like over time, right? But what a lot of people don't realize is that the cash supply is only 8%, right? So most transactions that happen already actually are digital transactions, zeros and ones, right? So there's only 8% of all the cash, all the dollars that exist, only 8% of them are actually in the form of cash. And then only 16% of all transactions are made with cash, which means the vast majority of other transactions are made digitally. So this actually creates another layer to the challenge of classification. Because if we know that zakat, among other things, is based upon a consideration of gold and silver, okay, the first question is, okay, well, do the rules of riba and zakat apply to paper money? Okay, and if it does, then what is let's say, the analog that we're going to use to evaluate paper money? Is it going to be gold or silver? All right? Same thing for our zakat. When people pay zakat, they base it upon what we call the nisab of either gold or silver. I typically go with silver myself. But most Muslims say with gold, because you don't have to pay zakat until you have a certain amount of gold. Like today, there'd probably be like $10,000, right, in your savings, right? Surplus of $10,000 at least over a period of a year, and then after that year, you pay 2.5% on that $10,000. Yeah, okay, but what if we did it on the basis of silver? It's going to be a lot lower than that, a lot lower than that, right? And you would have to pay zakat, right, based upon that lower amount. So we're already struggling with some. In other words, is that we're not able to fulfill the original commandment completely because we're not transacting with gold and silver. And so we transact with paper money, and we say, okay, riba applies to it, zakat applies to it. Does it? Do they? But then now when we start talking about digital money, it's like, now we're taking it a step further. So we're not even talking about physical cash anymore. So we're talking about just technology and, right? Do the rules of zakat and riba continue to apply? So again, it's not a black or white issue. That's the whole point I'm trying to make here. And then we have what is coming what's called cryptocurrency. Cryptocurrency can be defined as a type of digital currency that typically only exists electronically. It's a payment system that doesn't rely on traditional banks to verify transactions. Instead, it operates on decentralized networks, most notably blockchain technology, which uses cryptographic techniques to secure transactions and verify the transfer of ownership. So cryptocurrency is going to very soon become widespread use. Right? So we already know that a lot of people will already use it, but most of the planet still don't use cryptocurrencies. Right? It's a very small percentage of the planet actually utilizes cryptocurrency. Like we know, of course, the most popular of them is Bitcoin. Bitcoin is right. Well, it's $109,000, $108,000 per coin now. And I remember when it was 20 cents, right? And didn't think anything of it, right? Could be filthy rich by now, right? If I had known, right? I was under the impression that never would the government allow some other currency to become competitive with the dollar, right? And some people actually say because Bitcoin has somewhat been allowed to do so that it may be a psyop, Allah knows best, right? That itself is a matter for debate. But it's decentralized, to say, so it's not controlled by the government. It has a community that transacts with it, and its value increases year after year based upon the demand for them, right? But it itself is a technology, among other things. And so there are a number of challenges, of course, that cryptocurrencies they pose to many different sectors of society. The banks were opposed to Bitcoin and other things for a number of years, trying to suppress it. Why? Because all the people who created Bitcoin, what they did was they created a new commodity of investment. And all that money that's going into Bitcoin originally would have gone into the banks. So that made them upset. Say, well, wait a minute, we didn't authorize this. We're not making money off of this, right? And they've been fighting for different ways to gain some leverage over the cryptocurrency community. And it seems that they're kind of getting there. They're almost there now, right? That the bankers are going to eventually be able to make some money, right, off of this. Right, and then they're going to be praising, all these things, and I'll tell you before, cryptocurrency is just used for just unlawful activities and for money laundering and for criminal activity and terrorism, But then once they actually get their hands on it, they're going to say, hey, the best thing that ever happened, right? So there's a possibility again of certain banks becoming insolvent, and basically because the technology allows for people who don't have bank accounts to actually hold it. You don't need to open a bank account anymore, right? It also can be, one particular danger to consumers is what is called central bank digital currencies. You probably heard something about that. In other words, it's like the type of crypto that is centralized by the government. The government creates it. Like, for instance, in China, right, they have their own CBDC, right, central bank digital currency. They have a social credit system where, of course, if you say things or do things the government doesn't like, they can freeze your money. They can tell you can't go places. So there's a particular danger involved there, right? And as a video, at the end of today's talk, I'm gonna show you like a short, like 4-minute video, just kind of emphasizes those particular dangers. And with respect to Sharia, like again, we talked about issues of zakat, the challenges there. Is it gold and silver or is it digital money in marriage? There's a minimum dower that is stipulated for a woman in certain methods, like the Maliki schools, that the mahar can be less than what is called rubu' dinar, a quarter of a dinar. Okay, well, what if we're not transacting gold anymore, right? So, and then we move on from cash, and then we move on to digital money. Is digital money, like if I give, if a person were to give his future wife some cryptocurrency, right, or just transfer something to their bank account. Of course, we all know we've already come to accept that transferring money to the bank account is really money, right? But I'm just kind of raising a more methodological and philosophical issue. But in terms of crime as well, you get your hand chopped off if you steal something of a certain worth, among other things, right? So let me try to finish this off. So here, actually, I didn't send you. I wanted to send you the video too. Let me see if I can send you the video. That way, both those on Zaytech's YouTube page can hear, as well as my people on my particular stream want to play this video. Where is it? Yeah, there it is right there. Let me see. I can forward it to you. Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Actually, it's a PowerPoint. It's a PowerPoint, right? Okay, yeah, there we go. Okay, yeah, go right ahead. Yeah.
We're about to abandon the traditional system of money and accounting and introduce a new one. And the new accounting is what we call blockchain. It means digital. It means having a almost perfect record of every single transaction that happens in the economy, which will give us far greater clarity over what's going on. It also raises huge dangers in terms of the balance of power between states and citizens.
We are shifting to a new financial system, but the general population is not shifting to a new financial system. It's shifting to a control grid.
CBDC can allow government agencies and private sector players to program, to create smart contracts, to allow targeted policy functions. For example, welfare payment. For example, consumption coupon. For example, food stamp. By programming CBDC, those money can be precisely targeted for what kind of people can own and what kind of use this money can be utilized.
A key difference with the CBDC is that central bank will have absolute control on the rules and regulations, and also we will have the technology to enforce that.
They're saying we can control with rules. We don't need currency anymore. And so it's no longer a financial system or a currency system. It's purely a digital concentration camp. It's a slavery system.
When Catherine Austin Fitts talks, we should listen. She's a former high-level investment banker in New York and held senior office in the first Bush administration in Washington.
There may be 1,000 models of how it could work. But essentially, you will have, whether it's a banking account or a credit card, and it can be turned off and on. So my incentive system is not you go to work and work hard and you get money. My incentive system can be based on how you behaved in the last 5 minutes, on a 24/7 basis.
CBDCs, as the name suggests, would be issued by central banks like the Federal Reserve in America and the Bank of England, not by high street banks. They would signal the end of cash, and every transaction you make would be transparent and held on a permanent database. Crucially, under a net zero regime, your carbon footprint could be at the heart of the system.
We're developing, through technology, an ability for consumers to measure their own carbon footprint. What does that mean? That's where are they traveling? How are they traveling? What are they eating? what are they consuming on the platform? So individual carbon footprint tracker.
This can be the infrastructure for a carbon credit system. It's totalitarian control, and if people don't become aware of it now, it's going to be too late to backtrack.
In an unknown future, one thing is certain. Digital IDs are essential to the project. If they become compulsory, data on every detail of our lives will be monitored, stored, and monetized. Nothing, but nothing, would be private.
For younger people, often it's the case that they like technology, they're completely au fait with it, they enjoy it. So they don't see the dangers that technology can bring because, like a drug dealer does, you feed people, low levels of drug where it's all fun. And then later, when you have them addicted, you feed the hard stuff and that destroys their life. So in a similar way, all of this technology is currently pretty much nice, but when the central bank digital currency comes in and the control comes in and the censorship systems, then the younger people will realize all too late in many cases that they've walked themselves into a trap.
I'm gonna let this one's going a little bit slower. It's almost done as well. So almost there.
We're about to.
No, I think that was the last slide. That was it. That's the final slide. Okay. Right. So, alhamdulillah. I mean, it's been on a little bit longer than I originally intended, but I think there should be a lot of benefit that came from that. But, I have some time for a few questions. But before that, I just want to mention that for those who've registered, for those who have not registered, then starting tomorrow, everything is going to be private. There's not going to be any more public link broadcast for this particular course. So those who are actually interested in continuing to learn more, please do register. But until then, I'm here for a few questions that you may have, inshallah. Yeah, Woody, you have a question? Bismillah. Yeah. You want to use the microphone? Or there's a mic? Okay. Oh, come to the mic.
First one is, so I think you mentioned in the beginning that this is a compilation to a certain degree of not different fiqh opinions. You obviously are Maliki, but I guess when it comes to mu'amalat, is there a strict madhabi difference like there is in fiqh of worship type stuff, or is it more blended when it comes to madhab and especially when it comes to modern issues?
Yeah, I mean, you do have some issues in the madhab where some madhabs allow for certain types of transactions that others will say they're haram. Right? You do have that. For instance, what is called bay' al-bara'a, which is, how can we translate that? It's when you buy something as is, for example, right? You go buy a car, used car, and the owner says, hey, I don't know if there's anything wrong with the car, but you want to buy it, you have to buy it as is. Don't come back to me later on telling me that you found a problem with this or that, right? So bay' al-bara'a, the Malikis, they're considered it a valid type of transaction. The Shafi'is say no, right? Just for example. But in modern Islamic finance, there's a lot of what we call legal, what's in Arabic called talfiq. There's a lot of sort of legal eclecticism, right? In other words, it's sort of cutting and pasting between different schools. And what you find is that it's sort of a prohibition-oriented industry in the sense that they begin with the assumption that just because this transaction did not originate with Muslims, it has to be haram, and we have to find a way to make it halal, right? As opposed to taking the traditional position of majority of ulama, which is that, listen, this is a novel transaction, and it doesn't matter that it didn't start with Muslims, but it's halal until you prove it's haram, right? So basically what happens is that, let's say on one particular transaction, 3 of the schools say haram, and then there's one that says it's halal. The ulama generally say, okay, we're going to go with the one that says it's halal. Right? So but generally those same ulama would tell you that in ibadah, you can't do that. Okay, you can't say, okay, I'm going to take part from the Hanafi school and part from the Shafi'i school, from the Hanbali school and put it all together and then do it. But in this area, for some reason, there's an insistence on validating the transaction simply because we found one school who actually says that this thing is actually halal. Yeah.
And second question, because you were talking about like government economics and things like that, I was wondering, this is more hypothetical, or not hypothetical, but I guess it's dealing with like Islamic governments when they try to justify transactions based on it being like a darura or haja, like for governments, right? Like let's say, for example, right now preventing inflation and they need to raise interest rates and things like that.
Right.
How valid, in your opinion, are those arguments that it's darura haja, or is that just an excuse to engage in like riba?
Well, I mean, it's. I think the average person is not really in the place to necessarily judge government actions, because as long as we're not part of government and knows exactly the type of pressures that exist, it's hard to say that they don't have a valid argument that they're making when they say, "Oh, we have to be doing this out of darura." Because they have usually a more bird's eye view of things, and they have pressure from the outside and, maybe threats, right, that we are unaware of, right? And so they say, well, they said that we have to do this. The UN said we have to implement this new policy if we want to continue to be able to get access to a certain type of loan, for instance. Then it kind of play along, right? And of course, it's not a good position to be in, but that's just sort of the nature of life. There's survival of the fittest, that some people make it to the top and they're able to impose their dominance over other people. This is what happens. Unfortunate Muslims are dominated still, right? And all countries are dominated by the banks, to be totally honest, right? So the current banking system is changing. There's a revolution happening in the banking system right now. And I would say that if you really want to understand politics, international politics, just see what's happening in the banking sector, right? Because there's a saying that says that all wars are bankers' wars, right? And I think there's a lot of truth to that. And he who controls the gold controls the world, right? That's another saying that's out there. You could try to look at the arguments from a traditional sort of examination. You look at, okay, the nature of the contract, what are the integrals there? Is the type of asset that's being exchanged something which is haram or halal? And you can say, okay, yeah, it doesn't look like that. That's a valid sort of argument that you're making. But on the other hand, as long as Muslims are committed to not departing from the current financial system, then those pressures are going to remain, right? So, we got to print more money. Why? Because, we need more money, right, to cover the costs here. But we have to understand every time we print more money, the power of that particular currency, it drops, it goes down, right? And this itself has led to one economic crisis after another, right, since the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank, right, which wasn't the case prior to that, which really a lot of people don't know. Any questions online? Any other questions, brothers? No questions? Let's see if there's any questions. No, I'm not seeing any questions. Let me see. I'm going to look. So I'm going to go to Zaytech. Zaytech's life. I knew someone was going to ask that one, right? Yeah. And I still haven't decided whether or not I'm going to share my slides to anyone other than, of course, yourself, Brother Khalid. And I really do appreciate, Brother Khalid, you being so generous with your, use of the institution and just very supportive overall. And please support Zaytech Academy. Give me some time. I'm still thinking about whether or not I'm going to share the slides. But right now, what I have shared for those who registered, the readings, right, and the syllabus, the lesson plan there. So as we go along, we'll see if Allah changes my heart about the sharing of the slides, inshallah. Yeah. Yes, you will have access to the recordings if you're registered and you can't make it to a particular class. So each particular lesson will be live for those who are registered, but it also will be recorded. So for those who are registered who are not able to attend the live feed, you will receive a copy of the recording, inshallah. But this very first lesson was free to everyone, but starting tomorrow, we're going to be operating a bit differently. All right? Anything else? That's it? Okay, alhamdulillah. Well, really thank everyone for coming out, and apology for the long introduction, but I do think that it was necessary to sort of frame things properly, and I hope that some great benefit has come from that. Barakallahu feekum wa sallallahu alayhi wa sallam Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.